So thank you everyone for joining us for this session on the importance of board policy. We have Catherine and Kathleen joining us from Troon. So I will turn it over to them to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. My name is Katie Broaddus. I'm an attorney at Troon Law Firm. I've been here since about 2013 and then practiced in another Michigan school law firm before that. So I've been practicing for, um, I think, about 20 years now in school law. I work primarily in the areas of labor and employment, but also help with OMA questions, FOIA, other statutory issues that come up. I'll introduce Kathleen. Kathleen is an attorney who works in a lot of different areas, a lot of student issues, discipline, special education, but I know she has a wealth of knowledge also in employment and is working more with labor negotiations and labor groups. Kathleen started with us a couple of years ago. I don't know the exact number, Kathleen. My time tends to merge together, but I know it was several years ago coming from Arizona, where she practiced in Arizona for many years too. So she has a large knowledge of school law and is learning more about Michigan law as she continues to practice. So we're happy to have her with the firm. Um, to set the stage for you on the importance of school law, I think I have a scenario that we run through probably several times um, a day or a week that while we're getting the PowerPoint up, that Kathleen and I know probably experience. And that is our phone rings or we get an email and we answer it and it's a superintendent. And I'm not pigeonholing any level of experience, but it could be a new superintendent, it could be a more seasoned superintendent, but they are asking us a question. And I think Kathleen and I would both say that our first response to any of those questions usually is, what does your board policy say? And if we could see them, I think that we would probably see like a deer in headlights, because that always seems to be the first question that we ask, and it never seems to be the first place that other people go to get questions answered. So when I think about the importance of board policy, it is always going to be the first question that we ask, usually when we get a question that comes in from a superintendent or other administrator. So I always tell new superintendents when I do a new superintendent training or new board members, the two things in my view that you should have an excellent working knowledge of is your board policies. So you should know what your board policies say, what you have policies on, what you have discretion on. I would throw within that your administrative guidelines, because I think those are equally as important. And for me, in labor and employment, it would be your collective bargaining agreements. And I think if I asked Kathleen that question, it would probably be your procedure for student discipline, is another good thing that board members should be aware of, because those are things that come before the board frequently. And if I was a finance attorney, it would be, budgeting and issues like that. And those are all going to be found first and foremost in policies of how is the board addressing those situations through its policies. I think for boards, one of their first, that if you look at a top 5 list of what boards are even created to do, somewhere in there is to create good policies for the school district. If you look at superintendents and other high level administrators, in one of their first 5 duties, it should be to implement the board's actions in the board's policies. So those are, when I think of the importance of board policy, those are some of the things that come to mind, in that frequently in Michigan, in my experience, board policies are often passed. You spend a lot of time updating them, and then they're kind of ignored and people don't look at them again. So we are working at Troon to try to revisit that and make sure that people know what their board policies say. They have good board policies, and and it helps in the operation of the school district. It helps everyone stay consistent. and it's just essential for running a good district. So we're not plugging our policy service, but I will say that Kathleen and I both are very involved in the Troon Policy Service that we run here at Troon. We have 145 school districts that are signed up for our policy service and 27 ISDs that are signed up. And we regularly take policy questions from individuals that are part of that policy service and help to refine and improve upon those policies. So we've got a lot of experience knowing why policies are important and what makes up a good policy and what makes up a bad policy. So as we go forward, obviously, any individual situation you may have turns on individual facts. We're not here to answer any of that or give you legal advice. So just wanted to put that out at the front. We do have an agenda that we're hoping to get through. These are the slides that we're looking at, or the topics that we're looking at covering. So if we go forward with the board policy overview, we're looking at what that I think basic question, what are board policies? So I kind of gave you here what I think would be the Webster's definition of what board policies are. I think that is completely accurate, but I think board policies answer a couple very important questions. One, who has authority to do something in the district? Is it the board that has to take the action? Is it the superintendent that has to take the action? Or can the superintendent designate another administrator to take the action? So when we draft policies, we're looking at specifically, does it say the board must do this? Because there are legal areas where the board has to act. One thing off the top of my head is if you wanted to terminate the employment of a tenured teacher, the board would have to take action. The superintendent couldn't take that action. Or does the policy allow the superintendent and only the superintendent to take other actions? Or does it say the superintendent or designee? Those are all important things in a board policy to pay attention to. A board policy also answers, now that we know who has the authority, what do they have the authority to do? What is it that the board is allowing them to do? What decisions do they have to make? Now, I think that an obvious question that's not answered in board policy or shouldn't be answered in detail in board policy is how are those things going to be done? Usually those are left to administrative guidelines. So we're going to talk about administrative guidelines here down the road, but that administrative guidelines usually answer the how or the implementation of a board policy. How is it going to be implemented? So why are board policies necessary? And I would add, why are they important? I think number one, and we give you some 4 bulleted points here that I think are all applicable, but the first thing that jumps out to me for a board policy is that it should give the public, students, parents, and employees notice of something. It usually is the purpose of the policy is to give someone notice of how the district's going to handle a situation. Maybe it's a complaint, or what standard the district is going to use in making a decision. So several board policies that we've drafted says that the board or the superintendent or the superintendent's designee will consider the following factors when making a decision. So those are all things that I think why we have board policy, why they're important is that anyone in the community can go to them and know, get notice of those important things. And that's important for governmental bodies because any governmental body should have the aim of not taking action that is arbitrary. That is the cardinal sin of a governmental body is to take action that is arbitrary and without any real basis or backing to that action. So I think policies provide us with that those standards so that we're not taking action that is arbitrary. So we do that through the definition, the language provided in those policies. So what can't a board policy do? It does not trump your contracts. So if you have a collective bargaining agreement, and I see this all the time, you have usually you have a policy that addresses like Family Medical Leave Act. and it aligns with the statute. It does a very good job of just keeping you to where the statutory requirements are. But then you look at the collective bargaining agreement, and it says that a teacher may take a leave of absence for up to a year. While the Family Medical Leave Act doesn't say that, but the contract can provide more of a benefit than what the law requires. So a contract, just because the policy is different than the contract, doesn't mean the contract changed. What it really means is that the policy has been modified. So you have to be careful when you go into contracts that you're not that you are reviewing those contracts with the lens of what does our policy say, and you're not running afoul of a policy when you're agreeing to a contract. Very important. And it also can't alter legal obligations or violate the law. In my example, I listed that it could give a higher standard than what the law requires, but it certainly couldn't be contrary or require the district to break the law or break any other type of legal obligation. So that's why we always say have your policies, regularly reviewed and updated. What should the policies cover? We see the policies as a granting of authority from the board to the superintendent. So you're going to have a wide range of operations and governance policies going forward. You also would have anything that's specific to your school community, trying to customize policies to the best extent possible to make sure that if there's a specific issue within your community, you would have a policy on that. So policies can change from district to district. Within our policies, we have embedded some customization options for different districts. So one policy is not a one size fits all that other districts may have, but you want to make sure you're covering a lot of those operations, employment, student issues, giving the guidance to administration and notice to the community on how you're going to handle a situation. So some common board policy categories we've listed here. You've got board operations, administration, programs, staffing. In our policy, we separate using the Fair Labor Standards Act. So people that are exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, like your professionals like teachers, social workers, those other ancillary staff, they have their own set of policies. People that are hourly employees that are subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act, they have a different set of policies. And then administration would have a third category of policies. Why do we do that in that way? Because different laws apply to those people differently. So we want to take those considerations and apply them to the policies and not try to do a one size fits all for all your different levels of employees. And then you're going to have a lot of policies that address student issues. As much as you have employee issues, you're going to have other student issues that need to be addressed by policies. Finance, I'm not a finance attorney, but I know that you have to have policies on finance. So I'm sure those are very, very important. And then you have property operations, community relations. One of the biggest policies I tell people to look at is their visitor and volunteer policy. You want to know who else can be in your building and when they can be there and how you can regulate that. So that all falls within operations and community relations. There are some categories that are required by the law that districts have policies for, and we try to list those off here. So reimbursable expenses, I think not just for board members, but also for employees. There's several conflict of interest laws that apply to board members. It can apply in the form of nepotism to employees. So you want to make sure that you have policies on those. Michigan has a statute after a very public expose by either the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press on gifting procedures that happened a couple decades ago and gifting issues where people got very expensive gifts from vendors and other interested parties. We have a very narrow and kind of detailed law that talks about gifting. And that also falls within, use of alcohol, golfing, all of those things. Those are all prescribed under Michigan law, and you should have a policy that applies to that. Parent involvement, I believe there's a federal statute that requires a policy on parent involvement. Sexual harassment is required under Michigan law. Search and seizure generally is a good policy to have, and locker searches in particular are required to have a policy. If you have lockers, you have to have a locker search. And what we're seeing, and in this list particularly, is the onslaught of what I call legislative activism, maybe is the right word, where the legislature every year, in an attempt to kind of show that it's working and in passing laws, they pass a slew of laws, and every year it seems to feel like there's more of them, where they tell school districts, you have to do X and you have to have a policy that says you're going to do X. So it's not just enough to tell the school district, you have to exercise the following rules for restraint and seclusion. You also have to pass a policy that reflects the restraint and seclusion laws. So that's where we saw restraint and seclusion, bullying, performance enhancing drugs. I think there's a concussion protocol policy, things like that. All are stemming not just because we think that it's good to have that as operations of the district. Some of these policies, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at, but they are required now under Michigan law in order to say that you're complying with the law. You have to have the policy. Ideal board policies. So this is kind of my Goldilocks analogy, is sometimes you don't want it too hot. And when I say too hot, I mean that it is has way too much detail. It prescribes an action or all the actions that need to take place. And it really leaves little room for discretion. Those policies I think are too hot, but I don't want them to be too cold either, which is it just says something like, we will follow the Fair Labor Standards Act, or we will follow the Family Medical Leave Act. So we want them to provide enough detail that anyone can go to them to review, what do I need to do in this situation, or what's the applicable law, or what red flags should I be looking for. But we don't want to pigeonhole your administration to have to take a position or have to take an action that we don't, as lawyers guiding the district, don't think is the best action to take. So that's where I think you have to find that sweet spot in the middle of enough detail, but also enough discretion. So that's where I think an ideal policy would fall in. Problematic policies, probably not surprisingly, are the opposite of what I just described. So they provide way too detail and don't leave room for discretion. An example that I have is when I see someone has filed a sexual harassment complaint, and I look at the policy, and the policy says you have to finish the investigation within 7 days of the filing of the complaint. Well, that may be generally something that could happen, but in my situation, maybe the respondent is not available, to be interviewed, is not available to have a discussion with us. Maybe other witnesses are not available. Sometimes in some situations, somebody may be on a leave of absence, or they may be in the possession of the law enforcement. There's a lot of situations that may come down that makes that timeline impossible to meet. So we want to make sure that we're considering that there are things that could come up that we don't even know we don't know, and we don't want the policy to prohibit us from being able to do a thorough investigation. We try to not just restate the law in our policies. Some of those are hard when you're doing FMLA or a very probably Title IX, when it's very driven on the statute. But we try to put that not in legalese, but make it so that anyone who reads it can understand it. Even your parents, your students, the community, they understand what the policy is saying, and we're not just regurgitating a statute. Um, one thing that some district policies provide, and we tried to eliminate this in our policy service, is that um, there's throughout the policies, there's a statement that says the superintendent shall create administrative guidelines reflecting this policy. And many of you, maybe when you purchased that policy service, you didn't purchase the administrative guidelines. So that's problematic if it says in the policy that you're going to create administrative guidelines and you didn't actually do that. So trying to not have that type of a mandate in those policies, that just makes the district look like it's dropped the ball on something. And then, of course, anything that's unlawful, and then anything that cedes board authority to another agency would be also a concerning aspect of a policy. All right, administrative guidelines. I really I appreciate administrative guidelines. I think when we started drafting our policy service, I will tell you we did it in two pieces. First, we drafted all the policies, put those out, let them marinate for a year, and just kind of people work through them and ask us questions. And then what we did is we started to work on the administrative guidelines, because the administrative guidelines were supposed to be the how do we implement this policy. This policy says we have to do an investigation. And instead of just restating what the policy says or creating more requirements, our concept for administrative guidelines was, how do we help the administrator do what the policy is saying that they have to do? And so we looked at it from the lens of, I'm a high school principal. I have 800 students in my class or in my building. I have 50 teachers. I have to do teacher evaluations. I have to do student discipline. I have to sub for the teacher that just called in sick. I have to do all of these things. And now you're asking me to investigate something or to do something else that's required under policy. So knowing that that person is wearing a lot of hats, we wanted to try to make their job easier by creating a checklist or creating a some other document that can help to to implement that policy. So trying to do those things where they are consistent with policy, but helps them to know what their role is in it. An example of, I think, a good administrative guideline is in our policy. We have a complaint form for someone who is complaining about discrimination. So an employee comes in and says, I've been subject to a hostile work environment. That complaint form is the first thing that they should be filling out. And I think that helps administration know, step one, finish the complaint form, then let's regroup and see what step two is. So that's one of the examples of what we're trying to do to help districts implement the policies and know kind of the procedure going forward. Another example in our policies is I've always had in my career the call. It's usually after spring break, before the end of the school year, where someone is reporting that an employee came to work intoxicated. And what do I do? They're sitting in my office. I know they're drunk. What do I do? We have a whole administrative guideline on step by step, what a form that you can fill out that you're observing, how you would get the person to an OCMED facility, all of those things that you would do to document the situation and who's observed them and know what to do next. So those are all situations that we're trying to anticipate and provide guidance for. Okay, policy considerations. These probably 4 points are the things that we repeatedly looked to when we were drafting policies. We wanted the policies almost to a obsessive level to have consistency, to be clear and not contain any word that is unnecessary, to have good organization, and to be legally compliant. So when we look at consistency, I see it a couple different ways. So avoiding internal and external inconsistencies. So internal, You always see it where it says go to policy XYZ, and then you go to policy XYZ and you realize that that reference is not correct. So always trying to make sure that any internal reference to another policy is accurate and makes sense, because there's no reason to have a reference unless we're going to the right reference. And it's there's no need to regurgitate a policy within another policy if it's already been stated in one place. Also, consistency is in terms. This is really hard. I will admit, when we started drafting the policy, trying to keep consistent with terms from one policy series to another was a something that I hadn't anticipated would be this difficult. But as simple as the term day, or the term parent. Is that parent and guardian? Is that is day school day, work day, calendar day? So making sure that you're keeping those, you know what those terms mean, and that you're applying them consistently. One of the biggest frustrations that we had from districts when we started the policy series was people were just sick of having multiple policies on the same issue. So you would have an FMLA policy in the administration section. You would have it in the support staff section. You would have it in the teachers section. You would have it in another section. Anti-harassment was the same thing. You could practically wallpaper your office with all the different policies that were in there multiple times. And that is sure, it covers all your bases, but it creates a whole lot of work when you're going to update a policy that you don't update it once, you update it 6 times. So we wanted to make sure that if the policy is important enough, it is in there once and it applies to the correct group of people. So that's another issue, is that you would have policies that would apply through multiple levels, but then we would read that policy in the context of a support person and think, well, that doesn't apply to a support person, that would apply to an administrator. So that's why we wanted to customize those for those individual groups and not apply policies throughout all employee groups. Again, I've talked about identifying who has the responsibility to act, aligning other school documents to policy, again, trying to work this through as a whole system with forms and administrative guidelines that attach. And then we also have in our policy system, we have a updated handbooks. So that was the third piece of the policy system. We started with policies, then we went to administrative guidelines in year 2, and then in year 3, we did updated handbooks. So both student handbooks and employee handbooks. Employee handbooks are something, they're not as common in Michigan before we started this policy service, but we really wanted to tie the policies to the handbooks. And again, that goes back to the notice requirement that I was talking about. I can't tell you how many times we've had employees that have committed some type of misconduct, and we say, well, don't you know this policy says you can't do that? For example, our policy says that a teacher couldn't drive one student home after school unless there was some type of consent or permission given by the parents. We just have found through the years that that is the optics of that is a very bad, can turn very poorly for the district. So so we've said you cannot drive those students home. We wanted to make sure that that is both in the policy and in the handbook, so that nobody can say we didn't know that that was a rule. So we've included that in handbooks, and that employees then sign off on their handbooks that they've received them and read them. And I think that that helps districts in those difficult situations. Clarity and no fluff. We wanted, of course, to make the policy straightforward and easy to understand. We don't want to have legalese or legal concepts. You can have legal references. I think that's very important and helpful at the end of the policy to have a legal reference, but it's not necessary to use formal English, the King's English, so to speak, in drafting policies. If it can be said in 10 words, we don't want to use 20. We like to the word are looking at what is superfluous here, because and when you add superfluous language, it makes that language a matter of interpretation. So what did you mean by that? If we can just make it clearer and more concise, that's where we want to go. Next we're going to organizational strategies. This was probably my favorite change that we made when we did our policy service. Is we found that in other policy services, there's a broad heading of students, and then there are 50 policies listed below that. And that's not very helpful when you're looking for a policy on search and seizure. So we wanted to include obviously a table of contents, but also internal categories of policies that make it easier for you to find. If I'm looking for the student search and seizure policy or the student speech policy, what I'm looking for is what rights do students have in those situations. There's a students' rights section in our policy. Same thing with employees. If I'm looking to know what is the whistleblower policy, there's an employee rights section there. So being very thoughtful about how those policies are organized, it makes it easier to find. It makes it make sure that you're finding the right one and they're not in multiple places. It's just under one umbrella category. I think that was a big improvement on the policy service. More on the organization, defining key terms, avoiding multiple policies on the same topic, which is what we've talked about, and clearly identifying those positions that are responsible for certain aspects, avoiding specific names. If you're naming a coordinator, a Title IX coordinator, a FOIA coordinator, you're not giving a name, but you're giving a position so that if that person leaves, you're not having to update the policy. You're able to have a position that's responsible for those duties. And then finally, legal compliance. I doubted if anybody's surprised by this, having two attorneys reviewing this and drafting policies, but we always are cognizant of what new laws have happened, new case law that's come down interpreting laws. One example is there was a case on FMLA leave, and it talked about you can take FMLA to care for a family member. And one court in I think it was the Sixth Circuit interpreted that family member language to mean not just your parent, but somebody who stood what's called in loco parentis to a parent. So maybe I didn't have a biological parent, but I had a grandparent that was as close to me as a parent, or a someone else, a friend's parent that took me in and allowed me to stay in their house, and now they are sick, so I want to take leave to be able to care for them. That was interpreted to apply to the FMLA statute. So we take that law and we go into our FMLA policy, and we make sure that that's updated to reflect what the new legal standard is. So very important to have those policies reviewed. We review them annually, but we do throughout the year have to do regular updates when laws change. And I think we're going to be seeing one pretty soon here, because Title IX is always something that keeps us on our toes and makes changes. So we're anticipating having to do a policy update for that. So with that, I am going to toss over to Kathleen to talk about the next topics in the presentation.
All right, thank you, Katie. So Katie gave you lots of broad sort of the theoretical reasons behind everything that we're doing. I'm going to try to talk a little bit more practically. How do we adopt and implement policy? One of the keys, of course, is I always consider policy violation to be low-hanging fruit. So if you have an agency that's coming in, or you have, some other review of some sort coming in to look at a policy or to look at an action by a district, the low-hanging fruit is policy violation. So one of the most obvious places we want to comply with our policies completely is in the process of adopting policy, right? We want to do that correctly. Policy must be adopted by a majority of board members at a lawfully convened public meeting. So, unsurprising, Open Meetings Act, right? We have to do all of these things in public. And so all of your policies are going to be discussed and adopted at a public meeting. We want you to include the date that each policy was adopted and then amended. And the reason for that is sometimes things change, as Katie mentioned, mid-year. So, for instance, we have just had to update our Title IX policy because the federal government changed its definition of sexual assault. So, sexual assault definition is defined by statute. Policy refers to that, but then identifies what the definition is. That definition was changed, so we had to update everything. If, let's say in a year, I don't know for sure if your district has updated its policy to reflect the newest, latest and greatest definition of sexual assault. If I can look at when that policy was updated, I will know. If it has not been updated since, say, September 2025, I know that it has an old definition of sexual assault and that's something we're going to need to address. So that those dates are really very helpful to everyone who's sort of looking at those policies from the outside. And of course, check your bylaws in case you have any additional requirements for adoption of policies. Implementation. Well, as Katie mentioned, the responsibility to implement policies lies with the superintendent. So boards adopt policies and you anticipate that and you delegate to the superintendent the authority to implement those policies. And as Katie said, those administrative guidelines are critical because they can really give the superintendent and their designees the guidance that they need to be able to implement that policy efficiently in a way that everyone can understand. Now, of course, the administrative guideline needs to comply with the policy. So there are all these layers here. If a policy is updated because of a legal change or some sort of change in community that necessitated something different, we have to make sure we update those administrative guidelines. And it sounds so obvious. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, why do they keep harping on this consistency issue? Obviously. But I cannot tell you how often we look at administrative guidelines and handbooks, and they are not consistent. It is not uncommon to do a handbook review and to have a policy reference in a handbook to a policy, I don't know when it last existed, but it doesn't exist now. So we really need to make sure that all of that stays consistent. It is one of the superintendent's responsibilities is to keep the board informed if there's a need to revise either an existing policy or to create a new policy. So one of the things that your superintendents are doing, they're going out, they're listening in on trainings, they're listening in on legislative updates, they're doing all of these things so that they can come to you and say, it's time to update the bullying policy, or we have to update the opt-in, opt-out policies, things like that. So they're keeping track of all of that. If they bring it to you, it's very likely it's because it is a change that will need to be made. And of course, we'd like you to model good behavior. Know your policies well enough to be able to follow them. I'm going to talk about some specific policies that we really think, based on years of experience of talking with people and questions, that these are policies that you really need to know. You're not going to know every word of every policy in your large policy service, but there are some that are really important for you to know. For instance, what is your role as a board member? What are the parameters of your communications with members of the public? Things like that are going to be very important for you to understand, and when there's an update, to know what that update is. Okay, further information on implementation. It's not just board members who don't know policy sometimes. As Katie mentioned at the very beginning, it is almost always our first question. Well, what does your policy say? Even if you have Troon policies, there may have been some personalizations to those policies, and we need to know precisely what your policy says. It is important for your administrators to be specifically tasked with identifying and understanding the policies that will be most relevant to them. So different administrators, different levels, different places within the district will have policies that they need to know inside and out. You may have a transportation director who doesn't need to know a whole lot about certain things. I'm not even, I think I probably chose a poor example because transportation director probably needs to know a lot of policies about a lot of things. But if you don't need to know it, if it's not something you're going to use on a daily basis, we want to make sure everyone knows these series exist. But for those things, for a principal, it might be visitors to the school. It will be FERPA. It will be things like curriculum. Those are all going to be things that those administrators really need to understand, and not just know, but have bookmarked. That Katie and I can pull up a policy just almost instantly from any school district because we know where they are and we know how important it is to be able to get to those fairly quickly. Ensure that every staff member who is identified, now hopefully again, not by name, but by category or by position, who's identified in a policy knows that. I can't tell you how many times I've done Title IX trainings or a special education training, and I've said, oh, who's your 504 coordinator? Who in the room is the 504 coordinator? And everybody kind of looks at each other. I don't think that's me. And so, sometimes there's a restructuring, and this is, usually for efficiency, and it's usually administratively led. But you want to make sure that that is being communicated to the people on the ground who need to know that this is something they're going to be responsible for. Okay, policy updates. As Katie mentioned it numerous times. It's just so important. When do you update a policy? Well, at least annually. And not every policy is going to be updated annually, but every policy should have eyes on to see if an update is necessary. Whenever there is a change in the revised school code or the State School Aid Act, or some other Michigan law that is applicable to our districts, we need to make sure that our policies remain legally compliant, and that likely will require some kind of update. I agree with Katie that sometimes it feels like we are just getting statutes passed so that it feels like our legislature is important and is doing, valuable things. And I don't know that they always recognize, I think that they often do not recognize that this relatively small, narrow law that has just been passed is going to require an update to policy, an update to guidelines, administrative guidelines, an update to handbooks, an update in training, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to keep those reviews kind of ongoing, and we prefer, in our policy service, we prefer to send out a single annual update. So any policy change that can wait, we wait on because we understand that this is disruptive. But sometimes there will be something mid-year that has to be changed right then. And Title IX is a great example. Some of you may be aware that in 2020, some Title IX regulations were put into effect. We all did what we had to do. We wrote policies, we did trainings. And then in 2024, new regulations went into effect. And so we all did what we had to do. We learned those new regulations. We made policy updates. We made administrative guideline updates. We did all of that. We rolled it out. We did training. And within about, 6 months, fewer than 6 months, a federal court had decided that the new 2024 regulations were not valid for particular legal reasons and had essentially vacated them. And so then we had to go back to everyone. So within fewer than 12 months, probably around 8 months, unfortunately we had 3 different iterations of Title IX in existence. We hope that doesn't happen very often, but once in a while it will. And obviously we need to move quickly when that does happen. Sometimes there is a case law change. There's some sort of case that comes out of either the Sixth Circuit or the Supreme Court of the United States that says, this is what has to be done now to allow parents to opt out of certain curricular items, or this is what a prayer in school means now, or this is what speech is protected and what speech is not protected. And so when we have one of those big sort of sea changes in case law, we will have to update policies, and that'll be very important. Sometimes there's just a change in district needs. Perhaps the district is getting smaller, perhaps the district is getting bigger. There's all kinds of things that might happen. Perhaps the community really seeks a change and it's an appropriate change and something that isn't violative of the law, then those are things you might update. And outdated language. We have many, many terms that evolve over time. So we have, for instance, the Americans with Disabilities Act uses the term disabled, but it is based on a law that was passed about, 20, not quite 20 years earlier. And that entire statute used the term handicap. We don't use the term handicap anymore. So if you see it in a policy, it is an outdated term. Nothing legally incorrect about it, but we do like to keep those updated so that they reflect sort of current sensibilities about what the language is, and so that everybody understands what terms we're using, what we mean. How do we update policies? Well, again, by a majority vote of the board at a legally unlawfully convened meeting. If you get an update from your policy service, review it carefully. Understand why the change is being either suggested or required. And if it is an option, decide whether it's appropriate for your district. Review the administrative guidelines, all of that consistency. Some years, so not this last year, so I think it was 2024, for instance, we had a very substantial policy update that came out in June or July of that year. It was a lot. It's a lot of work for boards. It's a lot of work for administrators. We know that. We don't love it. But when it has to be done, you might want to think about, do we need to break into committee here to really get a handle on all of these changes that are being made? So what are some considerations you want to make when you do make policy updates? Well, if at all possible, ensure that the personnel who are actually using the policy, who are having to implement it on a daily basis, have an opportunity to provide input. Some legal changes are just the legal changes and it is what it is, but not always. And so we do want to have that input from the people who see how this gets implemented on the ground. Consult with legal counsel, of course. Some things that get changed in the law are almost inexplicable. So you might want to get a little bit of advice about why and what does this really mean. Ask questions. You don't have to accept blindly what you're told. How does this work for your district? Is it responsive to the district's needs? Will there be unintended consequences to making an update? We have to maintain legal compliance, no question. But some changes are optional. Sometimes it is because we are currently doing something a particular way, and it makes sense. You want your practice and your policy to match. The question will be, though, is it going to have a broader effect? Is there a ripple effect? Do we need to make sure that anything else is updated? And does this change, which seems to make sense in this policy context, have unintended consequences to another policy or administrative guideline that is, that is maybe something we can't do, that we need to revisit? So keep those things in mind. And always efficiency, right? We're always looking for efficient policies that our community, our administrators, parents, even students can understand. So what are some policies that we would like you to know? And again, this is based on years of questions and, sort of trying to problem solve issues as they come up. Some policies that we would really like board members to know and have a good handle on. in your board bylaws series, most of those, okay, so most of those policies you're going to want to be pretty familiar with. Specifically, some to point out, what are the board powers? The difference between board governance and administrative action is important. Really understand this will make the lives of your administrators better. This will make your lives better. Really understand, where does board governance end and the day-to-day of running the district begin? Understand the conflict of interest policy. Again, I think nobody ever says, I think I'm going to try to have a conflict of interest today, right? That's not what happens. But if you don't know the nuances, the details of the policy, it can happen. And it's fairly easy to clear up. If you know there's going to be a conflict, there's some pretty simple steps to take. You just want to make sure that you know the policy well enough to be able to do that. Katie mentioned gifting earlier. OMA issues, Open Meeting Act issues. Again, you don't want to be in a position where you have been cornered in the dairy aisle of the grocery store and some very enthusiastic person has demanded certain things from you, things that you could not give, right? Or you and two other board members happen to be in the same place, and now you've got maybe three other board members. Now you've got a quorum, and all of a sudden you're having a meeting, a board meeting that is not lawful. So we want to make sure you understand those things. Operations, I think operations is such a broad category. Some of the most important ones, Katie's already mentioned. Title IX, kind of can't say it often enough. You don't have a big role in Title IX itself, but you need to understand why things are happening the way they are, because it's very convoluted. Obviously, you want to understand how accounting procedures are handled. You want to make sure that when you look at something, you can recognize, is this compliant with our policy? Continuing with operations, again, lots of them, but communicable diseases obviously became important and very important in the recent past. FOIA, record retentions. These are the kinds of policies we'd like you to go and read and make sure you understand. In terms of employment, obviously your administration, your superintendent is going to be very up to date on all of these policies, but it is useful to make sure that you know what are, for instance, the employee ethics and standards policies. What is the expectation for employees? Personnel files, confidentiality. What can you and can you not discuss? What can you and can you not ask for? All of these kinds of things. Students, obviously we're in the business of students, right? That's the primary reason that we're all here doing what we do. And so there are a lot of student policies. You don't need to know them all, but things that come up fairly often, again, Title IX, that applies to students and staff. Certainly student discipline. You will, one of your least favorite roles as a board member, I suspect, this is what board members have told me over the years, is your role in student discipline. Nobody likes to have to remove a student from school. It is a role that you will play on occasion. And so it's really important to understand, what does your policy say about due process, how we remove students if we need to, about appeals, and what kinds of services have to continue if a student is removed. So I would encourage you to read student discipline policies and really try to understand them. And okay, so what are some pitfalls with board policies and administrative guidelines? Well, unnecessary timelines. Cannot emphasize, Katie already talked about it. Don't put in an arbitrary deadline for something because you need whoever is implementing those policies to have as much discretion as possible. It can be very burdensome on administrators. And of course, the definition of days. You have a consistent definition set out at the beginning, and you know that the term days means whatever, days that the central office is open, whatever you've defined it as, then your administrators and the community will understand what the policy is saying. And unnecessary restrictions and requirements. From our perspective as attorneys advising you, as Katie said, there's kind of a floor, there's a legal line that you have to be above in terms of certain things, but don't put it in policy to go so far above that you are making life a lot harder for administrators, and of course you're keeping that consistent with your CBAs and things like that. Um, we can we can be maneuverable in the administrative guidelines a little bit more easily. So just really caution against getting too detailed or too restrictive in your board policies. And okay, I think we are almost done here. Um, avoid policies and administrative guidelines that are too restrictive, that require board action when you really want a superintendent to be able to do it, or that it isn't clear about what the line or chain of command is to complete an action. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Katie for any questions that might have come in.
Sorry, I have not seen any questions. I do see something that says, what about coach? I'm assuming that's like an athletics coach. So typically, an athletics coach would be, they could be one of two things. They could be another employee in the district who is assuming athletic duties. If it's a teacher, usually that is covered by the collective bargaining agreement. If it's a support staff, we raise a big red flag about Fair Labor Standards Act and having hourly employees doing athletic duties because it brings them over 40 hours a week, most likely. So we raise a big issue about that. And then if it's not an employee otherwise, then you have a community member coming in, then you're really free to kind of have a contractual arrangement with them in a way that you kind of see fit. Some districts also use third-party contractors for coaches, which I think is an option. But you should just know that governmental immunity, which protects us from a lot of accidents that may happen with students, does not apply when you have a third-party contractor coming in and doing a job. So if you have a football coach and the football coach is hired through EduStaff, and something happens that causes a student to be injured during the football game and a lawsuit follows, the school district would likely have governmental immunity and is only negligent or only liable if there's gross negligence. The football coach would have less protection than the school district employees would have. So just as an aside there. Sounds like, Larissa, you answered the other question about the recording, so we'll turn it over to you.
I see one more question in the Q&A. It's not on the chat. The question is, can you say more about the superintendent and administrative guidelines enforced?
Sure. I mean, what we tried to do with the administrative guidelines is that those would not require board approval. So the superintendent would have more ability to change a guideline without having to go back through the board for the approval, because the superintendent may want to run an issue a different way than what the guideline provides. For our policy service, we always say if you want to change something, you can change it. We would advise going through legal counsel to see what that change is and to help us guide you. But the administrative guidelines are created so that the administration can create them, can modify them, and can customize them to your district's needs. Did I miss anything, Kathleen?
Nope, sounds great.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Kathleen and Katie for all the great information and great presentation. We will be sending out a recording later this week and a copy of the slideshow, so you will all have that. And we hope to see you at our next new board member session in November.